This is Mike Livermore, and with me today is Mitu Gulati and Lee Buchheit, both world-class experts on sovereign debt. Lee spent several decades at the law firm Cleary Gottlieb, where he was a major figure in the legal wrangling in the wake of many different foreign debt crises. The Guardian newspaper once referred to Lee as, quote, a fairy godmother to finance ministers in distress. Mitu is a colleague here at UVA Law. We're very lucky to have him. He writes on a wide range of topics, including sovereign debt restructuring. He also co-hosts the podcast Clauses and Controversies, which is a lot of fun, and listeners should definitely check that out if they're interested in the conversation that we have today. But just to get us started, I thought we might kind of begin with how you got your start, how you guys both got your start in sovereign debt practice. So Lee, what drew you to that area as something that you wanted to devote your career to?
Well, thanks, Mike. I appreciate the invitation to be on with you folks. It was, as so much else in life, pure serendipity. I had been posted to my firm's London office in the late 70s and early 80s, and this was the end of the syndicated loan boom. So the great boom that followed the oil shocks in the mid-1970s. And I got back to Washington. Washington was my home office, just a couple of months before Mexico declared a moratorium on payment of its external debt. And I got a phone call from a colleague in New York, and he said, son, you've been doing these syndicated loans. You must know how to restructure them. And I said, oh, sure. Little did we know that the circumstances afflicting Mexico afflicted 24, 27 other countries, and all of them would be driven into a full-scale debt restructuring within the matter of a couple of years. But working then on Mexico, which was very much the flagship restructure in the 1980s, many of the countries that followed Mexico called my firm, and we had the privilege of helping them. But I realized almost from the moment it started that this was for me, because the legal element in it at that time was very, very small. No one had done this since the 1930s. And so the legal component was probably 25%. Politics, both domestic and international, were 50%, and the remaining 25 was pure theater. And my weak spot has always been the law. So I figured this was perfect for me. And I just decided to make it my life's work and have done it for 40 years.
Yeah, that's fascinating. It is interesting how those early serendipitous experiences end up just shaping our life paths.
Yeah.
How about you, Mitu? How did you get interested in this general area of law as a kind of object of scholarly inquiry?
Oh, I think by mistake. I was a junior associate, like I think you were, a long time ago at this firm, Cleary Gottlieb, where Lee was one of the superstars, and I didn't know anything about sovereign debt. It turns out this is actually stuff that my father used to work on, but I didn't even know what he did. But I wanted to do foreign travel. The whole point of going to one of these fancy Wall Street firms, I thought, was I want to travel business class someday. and I had heard Lee Buchheit, like, he's the ticket to go business class to exotic locations. So I tried. There was a long line. I mean, he was the star, so everybody wanted to work with him. But the barrier to entry, other people did not realize as quickly, maybe because, I have a devious mind, was flowers and chocolates to his assistant. And then you could jump the queue. And then Lee got stuck. I think she told him, there's only one person who wants to work with you. And that was me.
Very smart. Very smart. How long did you guys work together at the firm?
Oh, not that long. I think our research collaboration, we became friends. And Lee quickly realized that, that I was sort of an incompetent lawyer. And he's the one who sent me away. If I remember correctly, a judge called Lee and said, I need a law clerk. One of my law clerks has gotten pregnant, or there was something that got it started. And Lee told me, he said, you're not very good at this job. Maybe you should try something else.
I never said that.
I think it was. He encouraged me to try other avenues in life.
Think about this academic thing. Maybe that'll work out.
Yes. But then a couple of years later, he had this client, Ecuador, and had an idea for a transaction that we had talked about, but it seemed legally dubious at the start. So he said, maybe this is something that, you and your students can think about. And we started thinking about it. And as we thought about it in class, we ended up thinking, this could actually work. And so Lee and I wrote an article about that transaction. He implemented it, and we've written at least one article every year since then, and that was probably 25 years ago.
Yeah, it's really wonderful. Maybe just for an audience that's unfamiliar with the world of sovereign debt, we could just start with some basics to kind of situate ourselves. So one question that I think kind of naturally arises, we're in the U.S. and we know that the U.S. government borrows a lot of money and that there's a substantial amount of debt. But it just as a basic question, why does the U.S. Treasury borrow money? Why, there's other ways of getting money. We can tax. We can, the U.S. government's actually in a position to print money. So what's the advantage of debt versus these other ways of putting little green pieces of paper into the federal treasury?
Well, the answer is politics. Part of it is politics. The only honorable way, as a politician sees it, that you can get money is borrowing it. The alternatives are politically unpalatable. They are taxing, which no one seems to want to do, or cut expenditures, which no one seems to want to do. So if you're a government and you spend more than you take in, that's called a budget deficit. The only way to cover the budget deficit is to tax more, spend less. Both of those are politically unpalatable, or you can borrow. And borrowing is, in one sense, an intergenerational sin. Some poor devil, sometime in the future, is going to have to restrict their standard of living in order to service that obligation. But from a politician's standpoint, the principal virtue of that poor devil is he or she hasn't been born yet.
Doesn't vote.
And they certainly can't vote. Now, you ask the other question, which is, why not just print this stuff? After all, we do have the printing press, and there is a theory, very popular in certain quarters now, called modern monetary theory, which is just that. Let's just print all we need.
Right.
The answer to that is that fiat currencies, that is, currencies like the US dollar that are backed by nothing other than an assumption on the part of everyone who holds them that they will be able to use them to buy a pound of butter or to pay your taxes or whatever it is. The value that the currency will have is to some degree linked to its scarcity. Mm-hmm. And if you simply printed endless amounts of money, you'd find yourself looking more like Weimar than you want to. And so it is principally inflation that is the worry with simply opening up the printing presses, plus the fact no one believes that if the U.S. Congress thought that it could spend all the money it wanted just by hitting a button on a printing press, my heavens, Bernie Sanders would think that he had died and gone to nirvana.
Mm-hmm. So it's a constraint on spending, basically.
Yeah.
And I assume that the position of the United States is different from other countries. I mean, I think the new monetary folks and others would argue that the U.S. is in a special position. One could presumably argue about that, but presumably printing money isn't kind of even in the cards for a place like Mexico or Bolivia or other jurisdictions. And what are the special factors that would make that that option especially, and the taxation option obviously can be very difficult when you have a substantially reduced tax base. So what are the factors that affect these kinds of decisions for developing countries especially?
The United States, along with a couple of other countries like Japan, has the inestimable benefit of being able to borrow in its own currency. So at one level, putting inflation aside, at one level, no creditor of the United States of America need worry that the U.S. will not have the money to pay them back.
Right. It's because it's dollar, just to reiterate, because it's a dollar denominated thing. So the U.S. government can get its hands on dollars as much as it wants.
Exactly. No Mexican finance minister can say that. Mm-hmm. And therefore, when you lend to a Mexico, you're taking a risk that when the time comes to repay, the country will not be able to raise either by exporting goods and earning dollars or borrowing dollars, the money to repay you. We also have the enormous benefit of being the world's only reserve currency. And what that means is that you've got almost a captive audience of central banks and others out there who need to buy your obligations. So we enjoy huge advantages, and Mike, we take full advantage of it.
Right. Yeah, I think people don't realize, many folks in the U.S. don't realize how advantageous the United States government is in these markets, and then we all are beneficiaries of that situation.
Yes.
It's really incredible. So, so who owns this? So I can buy Treasury bills, and presumably that's how some foreign debt is held, but I doubt that's the lion's share. So who's kind of on the other side of the transaction? We know that there are the borrowers, the states, and who's on the other side? Who's buying this debt?
Well, today the principal buyer is the Federal Reserve and the U.S. Social Security Administration. What has happened since the financial crisis of 2008 is that in order to stimulate the economy, the world's large central banks like the Fed and the European Central Bank and the Bank of England have been pursuing a policy called quantitative easing. What it means in practical terms is that they buy the debt of their own government that creates demand that reduces the interest rate that the government would have to pay on that debt. And that reduction in the interest rate ripples through to all borrowers, public and private, and encourages people to borrow money, build new factories, and so forth. So right now, an enormous buyer of U.S. debt is the United States. You might think that is incestuous, but it's the reality. Other central banks buy a lot of it. The Chinese hold more than $1 trillion of it. And then you've got investors, sovereign wealth funds, et cetera, that need to invest their money in something that they regard as a safe store of value. So,
and that now this is U.S. debt, which is considered safe, for various reasons. And what about the kinds of debt that you've often found yourself working on, in places like Mexico? Who are the typical parties that own that kind of debt of countries that are not kind of as well fiscally positioned as the United States?
Well, for an emerging market country, there are likely to be three categories of creditors. There'll be the multilateral institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions that were set up at the end of the Second World War, the IMF, International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the regional development banks, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, et cetera. Then you have what we call bilateral creditors. These are government-to-government loans. And then commercial creditors. They can be a wide variety. They can range from commercial banks to institutional investors, the Aetna Insurance Company, the Fidelity Mutual Fund, sovereign wealth funds, the Singapore Sovereign Wealth Fund, to so-called hedge funds, private investment vehicles that buy sovereign debt. And within that category, you have a subgroup that specialize in what they euphemistically call distressed sovereign assets.
Mm-hmm. So you've worked in a lot of instances where sovereigns have gotten themselves into trouble one way or the other, where essentially they can't pay their debt back. So how does this happen? I mean, is it just, like I know if I ever find myself where I can't pay my debt back, I mean, that might be because I made bad decisions. It could be because of an external shock that was unexpected. What are the kinds of situations that result in sovereigns kind of unable to make their meet their commitments?
I would say there are three types. The most forgiving are circumstances where the country is hit by an external shock. Mm-hmm. So the hurricane, mm-hmm. the tidal wave in Indonesia, the earthquake, mm-hmm. Or a pandemic, mm-hmm. That causes severe disruption to the world's economy and makes it impossible for the country to export its commodities. There's no culpability mm-hmm. with those things, and so they're frankly easier to deal with. In most cases, the cause of the country's problems will be chronic fiscal mismanagement. Mm-hmm. A country that, for the reasons we just described, the local politicians find it easier to borrow than to trim the public sector payroll or limit pensions mm-hmm. or tax. And so the debt relentlessly accumulates. And at some point, you see, these countries are completely dependent upon the willingness of new investors to lend them the hard currency needed to repay what they already owe. Mm-hmm. And if those investors get skittish, They will, in the first instance, increase the interest rate that they want to charge for those loans, but in the final instance will cease lending altogether. This is Greece in the spring of 2010. 300 billion euros, all in the form of bonds, and no one wanted to buy Greek debt anymore. So what do you do? Mm-hmm. But a final cause is sometimes just a buildup of debt stocks at a time when it is easy to do it. This afflicts commodity exporters in particular. So oil goes to $100 a barrel, and you're an oil exporter. Well, a lot of people will lend you money. Mm-hmm. And it isn't too hard for a finance minister to persuade himself or herself that if everyone wants to lend me money, I'll take it. Mm-hmm. And then oil goes back to $40 a barrel. Mm-hmm. And then you've got an unsustainably large debt stock.
Right. Got it. So so you have these different causes, and they're, presumably they can be mixed up with each other as well, as that you could have mm-hmm. some mismanagement and then an external shock or some, unpredictability in commodity prices, and things come to a head, and it becomes clear that that the country's in trouble. And presumably they call Lee Buchheit or someone in a similar position, and they say, what do we do? Like, we literally don't have enough money coming in. We could, if we try to raise taxes, more, we're worried that it's going to, depress the economy and tamp down on growth. What are our options? And so what are some of the answers that are, just in kind of broad strokes, what are some of the answers to that question?
Well, history says that countries facing those situations tend to delay announcing the need for a debt restructuring as long as they can. History says that politicians demonstrate a pathological procrastination. Why? Because debt restructurings are disagreeable, always. And if you can put it off to the next administration, that looks awfully good. If you can't, normally, not invariably, but normally, the country would go to the International Monetary Fund and say, we need assistance in the form of a stabilization program. The fund will send a team of economists down, and the first thing the team of economists will do is say, well, you've got these weaknesses in your economic policies, and we want you to fix them as a condition to the program. And that can often be politically uncomfortable because the weaknesses are the very things that the politicians did not want to do on their own, like raise taxes or collect taxes. And then the country and the IMF will usually say, if your debt is unsustainable, not usually, it will always say, if your debt is unsustainable as they reckon it, sustainability, they will tell you that you need to do some form of debt restructuring. So you need to go to some or all of your creditors and ask for some form of debt relief. And that then launches you into a discussion with your bilateral creditors, your government creditors, and your commercial creditors.
And then so these conversations get started, and presumably what the issuer here, the country, says is, look, we can't pay back our debt on the current terms. what can you do for us? And it just, presumably everyone's in a position where if it's broadly recognized that this is the case, that a restructuring is going to be necessary, the lenders want to get as much out of their existing debt as they can, and the borrowers want to pay as little as possible. So how do they possibly come to an agreement in these circumstances?
Usually with great difficulty.
Yeah.
The IMF will conduct something called a debt sustainability analysis. That's a forward-looking projection, which really says, based on certain assumptions about the economy of the country, how much can the country reasonably afford to pay in external debt service? And by reasonably, I mean every country, I guess, is theoretically capable of servicing its external debts if it took extraordinary measures. I remember one creditor telling me, "We simply don't understand why you don't sell Patagonia to the Chileans." I remember another one saying, you could get a wonderful price for the Acropolis. These are measures that are obviously politically impossible.
Just off the table, yeah.
Yeah. And then, yes, you can ratchet down austerity on the economy, but it is, in the first instance, an enormous political problem. Mm-hmm. And it is, in the final instance, a moral problem. Do you let your citizens go without food, education, and medicine in order to pay hedge funds in Greenwich, Connecticut?
Right.
That's how it's viewed. So the IMF makes that basic judgment, how much you can afford to pay, and then typically the country will cling to that and say to its creditors, "Look, this is the quantum of debt relief we need." And the discussion then becomes who provides it. The commercial creditors will want the bilateral creditors to do it. The bilateral creditors will want the commercial creditors. The bondholders will want the bank loans. The banks will want the bondholders, et cetera, et cetera. And so that is the negotiation process that the country is launched on.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting in the kind of examples that you're giving of how obviously and deeply normative the question of kind of how much can a country pay is. And that, I think that can get lost in some of these debates. It's not just a kind of a technical question about what the capacity is. There's just these kind of moral limits, and of course, obviously, if you do too much austerity and you stop feeding your population, it's not going to be good for long-term economic growth. So there's there's some of those issues in there, but just kind of as we're thinking about the normative implications of these, broadly kind of sovereign debt issues, you've worked with a lot of countries in these situations. And I recall at various points, over the last several decades, general kind of broader public conversations about debt, especially for the least developed countries, and the role that debt has in potentially, impeding economic growth and development. Do you have views on that? Is the current structure of global debt a serious impediment to development? Are there things that we should be thinking about very broadly to change the system, or are we in an equilibrium that is, maybe not desirable on every dimension, but a kind of reasonable, a reasonable accommodation of different interests?
Well, I think the first thing, Mike, to realize is not all debt is bad, not all debt is good. Borrowing money to build the bridge, build the road, build the factory that encourages economic growth, that is benign. The problem usually arises when the country is borrowing the money simply to cover chronic budget deficits. Mm-hmm. The politicians just don't want to tax because tax and you don't get reelected. For a while, the borrowing cushions disagreeable consequences for the citizenry. They're not aware of it, usually, because no politician stands up and says, friends, I'm not going to raise your taxes this year because JP Morgan is prepared to lend us the money.
Right.
But for a while, they're the beneficiaries. But that quickly runs out at the time that the country can no longer borrow to refinance, repay what it's already incurred. Then cometh the IMF, and the IMF will say you've got to raise taxes, cut the subsidies on cooking oil, reduce your public sector workforce, cut public sector pensions, and all of a sudden, the average citizen on the street says, oh my gosh, this debt crisis is having direct and immediate consequences. And by the way, this is a common thing. They don't remember because they never appreciated that the incurring of the debt saved them from some of these disagreeable things. They will also say a lot of the debt was simply squandered. It went to corruption. It went to build a statue of the dictator or whatever. So we never saw any benefit, but we're the poor devils that have to pay for it now that the IMF is here and we have to reform our economy to make us presentable once again in the market, so that we can return to this idea of borrowing money to repay what you already owe.
Yeah, so it's no fun all around. Me too. I was wondering if you had thoughts on this. I know it's a big question, but just the general relationship between high debt loads and development. Is it a red herring or is it a really serious issue?
Oh, I think this is a giant Ponzi scheme that we are in right now, especially given the much higher levels of borrowing that we have seen across the globe during the COVID crisis. And I would have thought that we would have given some consideration to the fact that debt levels are increasing, growth rates in many parts of the world are decreasing. In some parts of the world where, the economies are completely dependent on tourism, they're down to near zero, and that this will come crashing down. But we aren't. We're pretending that the easy money being generated by the Federal Reserve and the European Central Bank and the low interest rates that the developed world has faced, that's just going to keep going on and on and on. And I don't know. I think that Lee, who thinks he might have been able to retire, is not going to be able to stop working anytime soon because these countries are already crashing, and the debt restructurings, they're not on the horizon. They're coming tomorrow, day after tomorrow. So I just think this is, unfortunately, we've had a little bit of respite, but disaster is right here. It's not on the horizon.
Mike, let me give you the most poignant example of this in my career. I was called in to help a country some years ago, not by the government authorities. I was asked to come down by the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP. And you might say, why? Answer. It turned out the country was spending 60%, 60% of all the revenue the government collected in servicing its external debt. What that meant was that every other use of government resources, health, education, military, police, were the government was unable to provide them. And the UNDP, which had a very large office there, was frankly picking up the slack. So the UNDP said, help them restructure their debt so that more of the revenue can be deployed by the government in these normal governmental functions and take the burden off of us. So, and there are a lot of countries that are paying 40, 50, even as much as 60% of government revenues in debt service.
Yeah, that's really staggering. Before I do want to turn to this really interesting deal that the two of you are working on that has some very interesting possible environmental angles to it. But before that, I just have to ask, in light of kind of what Mitu was just saying is, I mean, that sounds like if countries start to go into a kind of a cascading global crisis where they can't pay back their debt, and presumably that has ramifications for the financial sector more generally, is that the kind of thing that could initiate a very serious financial, kind of a global financial crisis? Or is it the kind of thing that's sufficiently kind of cordoned off, or the amount of money we're talking about isn't, so massive that it might cause very real suffering and problems for the, kind of affected countries, but it wouldn't kind of broadly propagate through the whole financial system?
This is the really big question. There's a conflict in the international financial community. Maybe Lee will talk about it, about whether or not we're on the brink of just another Great Depression type era, or that we have figured out how to solve it by just pumping money into the system.
Mm-hmm.
And
it doesn't seem like you do that forever.
Yeah, 2 years ago, people were very worried. The IMF and the World Bank and the other international financial institutions put in place a couple of mechanisms, neither one of which has worked. The only thing that has worked is the easy money that sort of inadvertently worked.
Mm-hmm.
So, it's the solutions haven't worked, and the easy money is now going to stop because I think the Fed and the ECB are worried about inflation.
Sure.
Yeah, what we fear is a contagious debt crisis. That is a circumstance in which multiple countries would be unable to refinance their maturing debt at more or less the same time. Classic example was the 1980s, when you had more than 24 countries. We saw it a little bit in 1997 with the East Asian crisis, when you had Thailand and South Korea and Indonesia. But that's, I think, what worries people. For so long as the debt crises are in individual countries or a handful of countries, I think the system can absorb it. But if the circumstance were to spread, it would have a profound effect on the world economy, as the Latin American debt crisis of the 1980s did. It nearly brought down the banking systems in the developed world.
And so is this the kind of like on the order of magnitude of the 2008, truly massive financial crisis and great recession, or is it worse than that? Is it maybe not that severe, or we don't know?
We don't know, but the difference is that this would have severe political ramifications, because you would have countries slipping in many cases back into poverty, and it can be geopolitically very disruptive.
And we have to remember that many of the countries that are in trouble in the sense that they have huge debt loads and potentially won't be able to keep borrowing to repay the interest on those huge debt loads are still not out of the pandemic. I mean, in the West, it's so tempting for us to think that, especially in our little bubbles at universities, to think that this is all over. We're back to normal, when much of the world is not out of it. They don't have high quality vaccines. And now they go into a severe debt crisis. And the debt loads are just so much bigger than they've ever been before, that I am a pessimist. Maybe that you become a pessimist because you work on debt restructuring. So back of your mind, you pray for more debt restructurings. But this is not one I'm praying for.
Yeah, so this is all troubling and kind of terrifying. And to maybe move us from one terrifying, troubling crisis to another one, you guys are working on kind of how this, kind of came to my attention was a deal that kind of combines some of the issues that we've been talking around about debt refinancing with climate change, and thinking broadly about how to kind of get the necessary resources that are needed really globally to mitigate, adapt to climate change, and generally to address environmental problems around the world. So you both worked together on a transaction to restructure debt in Belize that had an interesting environmental component to it. So maybe we could just talk a little bit, in terms of it might be something of a bright spot, thinking a little bit about how that restructuring worked, and is it the kind of thing that could be expanded to other contexts? So what was the broad outline of how that restructuring worked?
I should clarify that Lee and I wrote an article about sort of, it depends on what Lee says, maybe the precursor to thinking about this, but Lee worked on the actual Belize deal, and I did not, and then I wrote about it. So all credit and especially all blame goes to Lee. But I do think it is very exciting in the sense of, if we do have a series of debt restructurings, maybe, just maybe, we can use that template to get some assistance for the environment as well. But Lee, I'll help you explain how you mucked things up.
Okay. Well, Belize, country in Central America facing the Caribbean, badly affected by the pandemic crisis. 40 to 50% of Belize's GDP is directly or indirectly tied to tourism. And of course, the tourists stopped coming. So it was a devastating blow. The country had only one bond in the international markets that had been placed back in 2007. It had always been troublesome. The country is regularly hit by hurricanes and droughts and things that make it difficult for it to service its external debt. And we had restructured that bond 3 times in the last 13 years. Along came the Nature Conservancy, a non-governmental organization, and they said, look, we have a program in which we, the Nature Conservancy, will borrow money from the bond market and on-lend it to you, Belize, to allow Belize to make an offer to repurchase that troublesome bond at a deep discount. In return, Belize, which already had a pretty aggressive environmental conservation program, agreed that it would accelerate that program and have it monitored by the Nature Conservancy. Those sorts of funds allowed Belize to make an offer to its bondholders to repurchase the bonds. There was a long negotiation, as you can imagine. In the end, the price was just above 50 cents on the dollar. But at the end, the bid and asked for what the discount was 5 points or so. And Belize said, we can't afford to pay more than this, but we tell you what we'll do. We will take a portion of the savings that this transaction produces for Belize, and we will pre-fund something called an endowment account that is managed by the Nature Conservancy, and the annual earnings on that endowment account will be used in perpetuity to fund environmental conservation projects in Belize, particularly in the marine area. Belize has the second largest barrier reef in the world, and it is a place of enormous environmental diversity and sensitivity. And so protecting it is good for Belize, but it is good for the planet. And this was an effort to appeal to the public statements by many institutional bondholders that they are sensitive to what they call environmental social governance issues, and that they're looking for opportunities to demonstrate their support for that. Well, this was a tangible way in which they could do it. And so it was a technique used to bridge the final step in the negotiation. But it will result in a significant amount of money being used in perpetuity for environmental conservation.
So one thing that is, to me, very cool about it, but also raises the question of whether it can be reproduced elsewhere, is the amount. Lee didn't explicitly say this, but it's in many of the press accounts, such as Tommy Stubbington's piece in the Financial Times, where investors said to him that they basically gave Belize another 5 cents on the dollar. Now, to someone who doesn't work in this area, this might not seem a lot. Belize needs a lot of relief. What's 5 cents on the dollar? But if you are following the literature on ESG and the greeniums, and it's tiny. So that to the extent any greenium, meaning sort of the extra price benefit you get for being green and environmentally kosher, is tiny. It's like a few basis points. 5 cents on the dollar is hundreds of times more than what normally we think people are willing to give for environmental protection. So either this was just a fluke, or Lee can do this magic again. But there is this disjunction between the reality of what investors are willing to give and the reality of what they were willing to give in Belize.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Let me just see if to reiterate the structure here, just to see if I actually understand what's going on. So Belize has creditors in the form of a bond. The Nature Conservancy goes into markets and borrows money that it will presumably have to repay. Well, maybe that's just step one. Nature Conservancy will have to repay the money that it borrows. Is that correct?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay. So Nature Conservancy borrows the money. The Nature Conservancy lends the money to Belize, which then it goes out to the bondholders and says, look, we can't pay back all of our debt, but we're willing to buy back these bonds at a discount, and this is what Mitu was talking about. We're kind of, what's the question of how much of a discount? And there's two factors that are going to affect how much of a discount. One is just Belize's financial situation, as kind of what we were talking about before, like how much can Belize actually afford to pay? And then there's this question of maybe Belize can get a little bit extra in terms of its deal, because it is going to kind of have this arrangement with the Nature Conservancy. And the environmental effects here are twofold, it sounds like. So one is in the terms of the debt agreement between the Nature Conservancy, or the original agreement between the Nature Conservancy and Belize, where Belize, Nature Conservancy lends money to Belize for this transaction. There's some agreement to engage in environmental conservation, and then in addition, there's this kind of the creation of this endowment that is being funded kind of by the discount that Belize is getting on the debt repurchase. Is that in broad outlines? Did I repeat back to you what you said correctly, or
yes.
Have I missed something?
Yeah, only minor tuning on the last bit of it. Mm-hmm. The quid pro quo for the Nature Conservancy lending this money to Belize was Belize accelerating its environmental protection program, mm-hmm. and allowing the Nature Conservancy to monitor it and all the rest of it. So mm-hmm. those were promises that Belize made to the Nature Conservancy.
Mm-hmm. Got it. And then the endowment was a kind of a second thing that happened.
Was a promise that Belize made to its bondholders, mm-hmm. that said, we'll take a portion, not all, but a portion that represented 1.3% of 2020 GDP. We'll take a portion of the savings, and we will pre-fund this account that the Nature Conservancy is going to manage. And it will be used in perpetuity for environmental conservation. So that was a promise to the bondholders. Mm-hmm. And in return for that, or the request was that treat this, if you want to put it in these terms, as a kind of sweetener. In effect, we're down to the last negotiation for how much the discount is. We think we can afford to pay only this much. You would like more. We appreciate that. But if you accede to our proposal, we'll put this into the deal, allowing you all to tell your shareholders, your investors, your regulators, and the general public that you are acquitting your environmental, social governance promises and objectives.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, it sounds like on its face to be a really wonderful thing, right? So the Belize gets the much needed debt relief that that it's after. The bondholders get paid back, at a discount. They take mm-hmm. As they say in the business, that they take a haircut. But part of that haircut comes with the ability to look spiffy, so to speak, and go out to the world and say that they're fulfilling their environmental kind of commitments, and that's good from a PR perspective. And the Nature Conservancy obviously is kind of engaged in this transaction to protect the environment, and the environment gets there's a broad environmental benefit. So it sounds, of course, I'm a skeptical law professor, so I wonder if it sounds too good to be true. So maybe that's just one quick question: is it too good to be true? Is there something hiding here that that if not that for reasons to be skeptical, that actually this story is as kind of win-win-win as it first appears?
Well, the missing thing that we haven't talked about is the loan that the Nature Conservancy is mm-hmm. extending to Belize. Mm-hmm. Represents more than just Belize risk. There's a U.S. government agency, the Development Finance Corporation, which is issuing what they style a political risk insurance policy which says that if ever Belize fails to pay, uh, this U.S. government agency will indemnify the Nature Conservancy and ultimately the bondholders who are buying the instrument that is the origin of all of these funds. They will ensure that if ever they have to get an arbitral award against Belize, that they'll indemnify the bondholders for that. So that was a crucial element in this. Belize, even with retiring its bonds at a 50% discount, still would not on its own have had the credit standing to sell a bond directly or indirectly at a tolerable interest rate.
And this kind of backstopped insurance, but essentially by the U.S. government, was that kind of made possible because of the environmental characteristics of this deal, or is that the kind of thing that kind of shows up in the background of these restructurings more generally?
No, it doesn't. It's very rare. I think the U.S. government is doing this in part in support of its own professed environmental climate related program, the things that you heard the president speak about in Glasgow this week.
Sure. That's really interesting. And it's funny how, and again, this is like the world of policymaking. There's the stuff that happens on the surface that we all see that is big and splashy. And then there's the very behind the scenes, underwriting or insuring a transaction that, is very obscure to the general public, but that can really have important policy consequences.
Yes, indeed.
Yeah. Well, I was thinking that's in some ways such a key part of our prospects for doing these kinds of transactions in the future. Lee probably can't talk about countries that are on the brink of defaulting tomorrow, but you have countries like Sri Lanka that I love dearly and that have lots of coral reefs, but a huge debt stock. And if you had the international organizations and countries like the US and also the European Union, if they're willing to say, look, we have something at stake here. If they engage in environmental protection, then there is a global good that we get a benefit out of. They could really enable these debt restructurings to happen in a way, beneficial way in which we've never seen it happen before. I mean, the way in which these debt restructurings have always happened in the past is what Lee described at the beginning, which is sort of, the IMF makes this sustainability determination, and then the country has to, do a lot of austerity and beat themselves on the chest and over the head about how terrible they've been, and then they have to behave well. Now we're thinking about it as a global problem. It's not the fault of individual countries or individual dictators. It's just, look, we had COVID crisis. That was a global problem. And we have environmental crisis. And we need to fix these with official international help. But I don't know. Maybe I'm too optimistic in the middle of being very pessimistic.
Well, it's a good... you need something to leaven the pessimism to get out of bed in the morning. So I mean, if we think broadly about this, I mean, is there any? I mean, I care about the environment. Obviously, I teach in this area and I write a lot about environmental issues. But I do wonder if there's anything special about the environment here. Is it possible that lenders could, facilitate, or the U.S. government, for that matter, facilitate transaction where similar types of endowments, that actually sounds like a particularly interesting kind of feature of this deal, were set up for things like infrastructure development or healthcare, or backstopping the government pensions, or kind of various components of a country's fiscal management or spending that kind of broadly speaking, people recognize are good ways for countries to be spending their money and maybe areas where they underinvest in. Is there a theoretical difference between those kinds of programs and the environment, or is it just that the kind of political stars align better on the environmental expenditures?
I think the latter. You could certainly use the technique to finance a variety of projects that one way or another would be motivated by societal good. The environment, and particularly the climate issue, is a planetary problem. It will require a planetary solution. And therefore, remember what we're talking about, particularly with commercial investors. You're asking them to forego receipt of money that they're legally entitled to. There's no doubt about that. And they will tell you, look, we have a fiduciary duty to the people who invest in our fund, our shareholders, our investors, some of whom are, the fire department pension fund.
Pension fund.
How do we justify to them leaving money on the table? Sure, it may do some good in your country, but if we give the money back to our investors, they'll do some good in their country. Mm-hmm. So how do we, the fact that climate and environment is so much in the forefront right now of being a planetary problem allows, I think, these financial intermediaries to justify to their own investors that this is something that's not, we're not just benefiting, the Republic of Ruritania, the borrower, we're benefiting all of us. And that shared sacrifice, I think, is easier for them to justify to their own constituents. And that's why I think at the moment, and the political winds may shift, I think to try to redirect these resources toward environmental conservation is easier.
Mitu mentioned the greenium, which I take to be a combination of green premium, and I think what I take to be the greenium in this instance was 5 cents on the dollar, 5%, which does to me sound like an awful lot. To be honest, I've always been somewhat skeptical of the kind of ESG conversation. I think there's a lot of optimism about private companies engaging in these kind of broadly socially beneficial programs. And I guess the root of some of my skepticism is just that that's just not what these companies are set up to do. They're set up to make money for their shareholders, and that's where they have legal obligations. And most of the folks I know who work in the sector have felt kind of ethical obligations to maximize shareholder value. So it's always been it's been a little unclear to me how much of this is just kind of PR and how much of this is real. So 5 cents on the dollar sounds like a lot. Does that seem like the kind of thing that we could expect in future transactions, or again, is it a consequence of a particular political moment, or maybe I guess the bond, I don't know who the bondholders were in this instance, if it was held, but kind of broadly by lots of different parties, or if it was kind of concentrated in a few actors, that might make it a little easier to arrive in a negotiation.
Mike, let me ask Lee, before you answer, let me add to Mike's question, because I'm a little puzzled and intrigued by what you got in relief. So one point, I think what is important to realize here is that it's not just that they got 5 cents more, or at least according to some of the press accounts, but they got something like 35% more of the votes. So Belize needed the votes of the creditors. It needed 75% of the votes of the creditors to engineer this exchange. They only had about 50% who had agreed. And then there was this slew of articles in the financial press who usually never report about little Belize getting into yet another default. But they had all these articles that praised the deal and talked about how cool it was and would have these beautiful pictures of scuba diving in the coral reefs. And then they got another 35% of the votes in a matter of days. And I'm used to these sovereign debt restructurings taking years to get an agreement. And they got this in days. So, Lee, this is both amazing and also reason to think, okay, how many countries are going to have such pretty coral reefs? And, all the hedge fund people I know, they like to go on vacation, scuba diving. So they sort of imagine themselves scuba diving by the pretty coral reef and saying, I saved this coral reef. But, if you're talking about Lebanon's debt restructuring, I don't think hedge fund guys are going to Lebanon for vacation.
Guys, let me rain a little bit on this parade. I don't think it's possible in the Belize transaction to quantify exactly how much this was worth. And I don't think you can say it was worth 5 cents. Inevitably, in a negotiation, you come down to the final bit. There'll be a difference between the bid and the asked. In this case, because we were talking about a discount level, one side says I can afford to pay 51 cents and no more, and the other side says we have to have 60 cents. Some on the other side say 65 cents. And so it's a question of bridging the inevitable gap. And the way this technique can be used most effectively is for the sovereign borrower, when they reach that point in the negotiation, to say, we can put a sweetener on the table that is not quantifiable. It isn't money, but it is glory. It is a vindication of your much vaunted social environment principles. And therefore, it is worth something to you, but I can't tell you precisely how much. And so that's the use of the technique. If the other side then says, okay, we'll accept these terms and won't fight anymore, that's the benefit. But how much, absent that, how much the negotiation would have gone on for and what the final result would be, no one will ever know. Mm-hmm. But there is one other thing. Mitu and I put an op-ed into the Financial Times in the spring with a technique, a different technique that is arguably applicable to a much, much, much broader range of sovereign debt workouts. And that was one which said that typically a debtor country will have to issue a new debt instrument. In the restructuring, the new debt instrument will reflect the debt relief that it has negotiated, either a principal haircut, a lower coupon, or a delay in maturity. So the country will now be obliged to pay in foreign currency the interest on the new debt instrument. And what we argued was that you could give the debtor country the option to discharge a portion of that foreign currency denominated stream of payments, discharge it in local currency if the local currency is invested in a project that the creditors have approved. Mm-hmm. The logic of it is this: every creditor going into a sovereign debt workout knows that it has to give debt relief. The whole raison d'etre of a debt restructuring from the creditor's standpoint is that you want to improve the debtor country's debt dynamics so that it can return to voluntary market operations and pay you back the residual amount of your claim. That's why you do it. And therefore, from the creditor standpoint, the only issues are how do you do it and how much debt relief are you getting? Well, a country has an external debt problem because it lacks the foreign currency needed to repay its external debt. You can improve the country's debt dynamics by saying you can discharge a portion of that foreign currency denominated liability by paying local currency. That improves their debt dynamics. So it achieves the creditor's objective, which they know they're going to have to accede to one way or the other. But the creditor said, invest it in an approved project. It could be environmental, it could be something else in the debtor country. Good for the debtor because it is saving the precious foreign currency. And also, unlike a payment on an international bond, normally the payment goes out of the country. It's gone. It's a deadweight loss. In this instance, you're taking some of that payment and discharging it by investing local currency in your own country. So that's a technique, I think, that has far broader application. Belize was unusual because it was a cash buyback. And you very rarely see those.
And the Nature Conservancy was involved, so you had this third party that was
Exactly.
And whereas what you're describing could be worked out between just the debtors and the creditors. So I can imagine a criticism of this kind of deal, even though obviously it has a lot of advantages in terms of achieving debt relief and seeing expenditures on socially desirable projects. But one concern I could imagine folks raising is that there's kind of a colonial dynamic here where you have, hedge fund folks, who like to scuba dive, forcing Belize to spend more money on coral reef protection than it otherwise would, or, creditors in general, dictating how these sovereigns, are going to spend their money. And of course, there's a north-south dynamic here, and a dynamic between developed and developing countries. And I'm curious if either of you have thoughts about that dynamic. Is that an overblown critique, or is there something to it?
I think this is one of the reasons why the environmental part of ESG is much more likely to work, because there one can see it as a global public good that we are all going to benefit from together. To the extent the money is going into making sure these countries have better democratic institutions, or treat women better, or have better judiciary, that all looks awfully like interference with their domestic structures, regardless of how odious we may think their domestic structures are. And it's sort of, Belize is an exceptional case, but I don't think that we've heard any complaints that the coral reefs are going to be preserved. I mean, there's something about the way in which people across the spectrum were enthusiastic about what happened that I think is about the environment. And I don't know, you're the environmental expert, so I don't actually know, how do you articulate why that worked? I'd be curious as to what you think.
I will answer that question in a second. Lee, you got cut off right when you were about to start answering the question, so I wanted to kick it back to you. We've got a little bit from me too.
Okay.
And then
there's a simple answer to your question, Mike. The way you phrased it was, and I'm going to paraphrase it, how do these foreign creditors get off telling the debtor government how it should spend its money? And the fallacy in that sentence is, it isn't the debtor country's money. It is the creditor's money. The debtor country has solemnly promised to repay these creditors a certain amount of money over a certain period of time. That is the creditor's legal entitlement. If the creditor says, we will accept less money from you if you devote the balance to this purpose, it is the creditors saying that you may use their money. And surely that's within their entitlement to do.
Yeah, that's interesting. That's that right. I mean, that makes sense. I think that just to kind of, Mitu's point was kind of broadly that maybe the environment is special on some of the the optics here. That if even Lee, under the kind of theory that you're offering, that this is that we're talking about is the creditor's money, then maybe there's something paternalistic even of saying, we're willing to spend our money, to benefit you, Belize. Whereas it is more in keeping with that theory, I think, to say, we want to spend our money in a way that creates some joint value. And I think that's probably a dynamic in the environment that maybe is a little different. Still, reforming the creating a fund for additional infrastructure investment could be jointly beneficial if it puts a country in a better position to pay its debt going forward. But maybe there's something more immediate about the environment. It's also very possible that it's just a symbolic matter, that there's kind of a feel-good side of the environmental investment that a fund for infrastructure wouldn't have.
Yeah. Again, I think it goes back to the effort that's being made now to convince every citizen of this planet that we are jointly invested in the health of the planet. And that for some of us to exploit the environment is injurious to all the rest of us. And therefore, look, I grew up in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, a very long time ago, and I remember the local industrialists who took the position that if God did not want me to pollute the Monongahela River, why did he put it in front of my factory?
Yeah, and there's surprisingly still people who think along these lines. But hopefully that's viewed as somewhat more in the minority than it was in the past. It's interesting that some of the cultural divides on environmental issues. And one of the things I think is also fascinating in this area is, it would have been, this is a broader thing, but I think that, back then, where would the banks have been on a question like that, right? Where would the kind of the financial industry would have probably been more on the side of the industrialist by the river. And these days, finance is a pretty green, culturally a pretty green group of people who are concerned about the environment, and that. That just from a personal level, I think many people are. So I think that's an interesting development that we've seen in the past, recent decades.
Yes, indeed. To set it in context, the phenomenon you've just described is one in which a lender able to lend, let's say, to a polluting steel mill, and earn a higher interest rate on that loan, refrains from doing so for these motivations. The phenomenon we've been discussing for the last hour is one in which a lender entitled to receive a higher interest rate voluntarily forbears from asking for all of it if the difference is invested in an approved project in the debtor country. it's the same thing from the investor's standpoint. In one case, he's forbearing from collecting money he's already owed. In another case, he is forbearing from lending money that he knows he could lend and earn a higher return than he does to a green project.
Yeah, and we got it. Again, even with some skepticism on this kind of ESG movement, I think my own view on this, for what it's worth, is that it's ultimately it's a sign of hopefully shifting politics, and will likely be part of a broad social response to environmental problems. Well, I think that I've taken enough of your guys' time. I think we could continue talking for hours about these really fascinating issues. So I think I will just end with a big thank you for the conversation today. I learned a lot, and it's all really fascinating stuff. And also thank you for working on these really interesting issues and staying engaged on all of these questions.
Thanks, Mike. I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you, Mike. That was a treat.